Welcome to lecture number 21, The Dawn of Modernism, part 1, Realism and Impressionism. So there's lots of isms happening now, and differentiating between them becomes a bit more difficult as we go, because things are changing at a more rapid pace than ever before. The time period we're discussing this week is roughly the late 1800s through the early 1900s, just before World War I. We witnessed the emergence of the modern world, rapid pace of change, and people that are starting to become aware of their modernity. The most important movements in art in the late 19th century were Realism, Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism. And we're going to focus on the first two for this lecture today. But first, let's step back into the context of the time. As the 1800s progress, quote, academic art is the status quo. And the French Academy was the organization that officially sanctioned the styles of art. And there were two that were really considered, two styles that were worthy of being considered art: neoclassical and romantic. We talked about both of these last week, and we talked about how they were kind of these two kind of rival kind of movements in art, but they had a lot in common in some ways, even though in other ways they were like polar opposites. But both of them were considered acceptable by the Academy. And really that was kind of all that was acceptable. It's kind of like the saying, I like both kinds of music, country and Western. They were filled with grand allegory and idealism, and that was the style of the day. Here's The Birth of Venus by Cabanel. And, it's a beautiful painting for sure. But this is a good example of what was deemed acceptable in the eyes of the Academy. And interestingly, they had a really strict hierarchy where they would rate the art, not based so much on the artwork itself, but more about the theme that it portrayed. So a very strict hierarchy. At the top was history painting. But this included religious imagery, or also included Greek mythology. So a painting such as this one would be like at the top of the heap in terms of the Academy. Just below that was portraiture, dignified genre or style of painting. That was second to these history paintings. And then came genre paintings, paintings of everyday life. Below that were landscapes, still considered, art, still considered worthy, but nowhere near as worthy as these grand history paintings or mythological, allegorical paintings. Next came animals, and then the very bottom of the list was still life. To be a student at the Academy, one had to pass an entrance exam and have a letter of reference. And in the Academy, they trained rigorously in a 4-year program with very formulaic instructional structure. Hopefully nothing like what we have at our school in the art program. And just so you know, it isn't. At the Academy, student competitions measured successful progress. The Academy also dictated acceptable standards for professional artists as well as students. And they sponsored a special bi-yearly exhibition called the Salon de Paris. It was a benchmark for whether an artist was considered successful or not. And the works, of course, were chosen by the Academy. But bear in mind, the Academy was very much rooted to tradition and refused to acknowledge the changing nature of the times. While artists all over Paris were exploring bold new ideas, the Academy was staunchly conservative. And into all of this comes the radically progressive artistic movement of realism. Now, it might seem like an oxymoron, but realism was very much a radical movement. Realism was about telling the truth, and which is not necessarily the same as naturalism, definitely not the same as like representational imagery that was certainly a big part of the tradition leading up into this. But for realism, the goal was to produce an unprejudiced record. It often consisted of social commentary. So rather than, it was trying to be real and true rather than glossing over the hypocrisies and injustices of society. Introducing Gustave Courbet. We'll call him a realist because his work was realism, but he never wanted to be included in any kind of a group. To sum up his philosophy, he was asked to paint religious imagery for a commission, and he refused the commission, saying, "Show me an angel and I'll paint one, but how can I paint an angel if I've never seen an angel?" This work, The Stonebreakers, was rejected from the Academy's show. It was too coarse. So he had his own show. It was called The Pavilion of Realism. This particular painting depicts two laborers, father and son, crushing stones to patch the country roads beyond Paris. And this was a never-ending cycle of backbreaking labor from one generation to the next that typified the way society was. But the thing is, this labor wasn't really romanticized or idealized. The figures become as hard and evident as the rocks and the tools. They're faceless, anonymous. There's no hierarchy of subject. This reveals the drudgery of hard labor, and that's it. The color scheme is all in dirty browns and grays. And you can see the brushwork evident throughout the painting. And an angular movement of the older Stonebreaker reveals a mechanical monotony. It was like humans were being used as machines. This particular painting was destroyed in the Dresden firebombing by Allied forces in World War II. Oops, but that's a story for later. Daumier was another artist that worked under the umbrella of realism. This is his painting, The Third Class Carriage from 1862. It presents an image of the poor in a third-class railway carriage. His work is often social commentary, and his images were spread widely in prints, and they chronicled the effects of industrialization on society, and they were often critical of the French politicians and the upper class. Daumier was thrown in prison because his art was deemed subversive, and perpetrators of injustice don't particularly like mirrors. There are not a lot of great sculptors from this period, but one big exception is the artist we'll look at next. Auguste Rodin was a sculptor who preferred to mold his sculptures instead of carving them. And his work was all about a surface texture and motion. These were molded in terracotta and then cast into bronze after that. And you could see the finger marks in the surface. The surfaces ripple and undulate, and there's a primal quality that really shatters the idealized notions of the human body. And we see massive hands and feet. Here's another view of the same sculpture. The sculpture was called the Burghers of Calais. It was a monument commissioned by the city of Calais to commemorate the bravery of 6 citizens who offered their lives to save the town. During the 100 Years' War, the army of King Edward III besieged Calais and ordered that the town's population be killed en masse. He agreed to spare them if 6 of its principal citizens would come out to be executed. And the sculpture, The Burghers of Calais, depicts the men as they were leaving for the king's camp, carrying keys to the city gates. It sounds in some ways kind of like David's The Oath of Horatii in that kind of heroism, and patriotism kind of aspect. But here we see emotions like fear and resignation and anguish instead of just the heroic kind of thing of the neoclassical paintings. And in fact, this wasn't a united heroic group, but it's depicted as a kind of a chaotic mess. It really captures a sense of motion and this kind of this fugitive and fleeting kind of reality. He captured the real emotion of the scene. It's historic, but not in the way the status quo wanted to see it. Next, we'll shift our attention to England and look at artwork by the pre-Raphaelites. This was an art movement that emerged in a way as a reaction to realism. It's, sort of like the pendulum swing. So it was a response kind of against the realism that was so popular in France. The pre-Raphaelites were linked to Romanticism. Historical imagery, fictitious narratives, but done very naturalistically, which kind of puts it like almost in the category in some way of realism. They believed that art had suffered since the Renaissance. Art before Raphael was the best. Artists like Fra Angelico and then Northern European masters. They had a love for meticulous detail to make fictitious scenes seem as real as possible. And this reflected spiritual and idyllic themes. John Everett Millais, this painting is Ophelia. He saw the modern world with disgust. Taken from Hamlet, Ophelia depicts he depicts Ophelia's drowning after going mad. This convincing naturalistic depiction seems real, even though it's a pure fiction. Ophelia has fallen into the river from a tree overhanging it while gathering flowers. She lies in the water, singing songs, as if unaware of her danger. Her clothes are trapping air, allow her to temporarily stay afloat, but eventually her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay down to muddy death. This is shown as exquisitely beautiful, pure, saint-like almost. We see symbolic flowers. The daisies near her right hand floating represent innocence, and the red poppy represents death. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the Salon of 1863 was gearing up to be a star-studded event. But that year, there was a particular outcry over works that weren't selected to be included in the Salon. That simmering kind of discontent that was always kind of brewing, sort of came to a head. Because it had always been the case that to some degree that there was an outcry over who didn't get accepted into it, and any art student who doesn't get accepted into a show can understand those feelings. But this year there are way more rejected works than normal. And many of these artists that were rejected saw themselves as part of the avant-garde, or the leading edge, the more revolutionary artists that were kind of pushing the boundaries of what art could be. People like the realists that we have just been talking about. Because this was like really the antithesis of the Academy and all of its conservative attitudes. The uproar got so high that the Emperor Napoleon III asked to see what all the fuss was about. And he decided that the public should see for themselves. So he decreed that there would be a separate exhibition for the rejected artists alongside the official salon, presenting the Salon des Refusés, the exhibition of the rejects. In a way that participating in this was kind of a gamble for artists, because essentially they're admitting failure, admitting that they tried to get in the salon and couldn't. But also, in another way, participating, just the act of being a part of this could be seen as a slap in the face to the Academy. And, making the Academy mad could be career suicide. but some exhibited in it anyway. And it was a miserable failure, panned by public and critics alike. As one reviewer put it, this exhibition, at once sad and grotesque, offers abundant proof that the jury always displays an unbelievable leniency. There is even something cruel about this exhibition. People laugh as they do at a farce. But because of this exhibition, no matter how widely it was panned, a particular group of artists, met one another. They otherwise might never have met. And these artists were sort of young pups that were kind of outside the mainstream. And they went on to change the art world forever a few years later than this. And we're going to talk about them a little later. But there was one older artist who decided to show the work in this exhibition that these youngsters all gravitated towards. This artist was Edouard Manet. Manet was a flaneur, an impeccably dressed man with perfect manners who kept abreast of current events and gossip. His day was spent mostly strolling the streets, observing the fleeting moments of modern life. By all accounts, he was witty, gregarious, and maybe because he was part of the bourgeoisie, he liked to shock the bourgeoisie, which he did with his monumental painting, Luncheon on the Grass. This painting was his offering to the Salon des Refuses, and it became front page news. It was scandalous in its contemporary scene of a naked woman in a park with two unkempt men. Why was this so scandalous? Mostly that he dared to show contemporary people in this context. That lady picnicking naked with two totally clothed male companions was a woman of the time. And rather than a classical, mythological woman, it was just a plain, ordinary woman. And that made it incredibly controversial. But interestingly, it was based on several Renaissance works, including Giorgione's Pastoral Concert and Raphael's Judgment of Paris. With Manet's, it looks like students posing to recreate a painting by a revered artist. In a way, almost making fun of it. That's something that, lots of people have been doing recently. In fact, that was an assignment for my kid in his 5th grade class, was to pick a famous painting and then, recreate it in a photograph. And that's kind of a little bit essentially what Manet is doing here. And that just the act of doing that is transgressive in the kind of the holy kind of purview of fine art, especially regarding the Academy at the time. But let's look more intently at the painting. The scale, just about 7 feet by 9 feet, that's a scale usually reserved for history painting. No artist would dare do a painting that scale that wasn't depicting such a significant, important event in history or religion or mythology. We also see a certain kind of artificiality of the figures. They fail to interact in a convincing way. The woman in the background is way too large for the space that's recessed. If you kind of look at it and kind of consider the amount of ground between them and then to that little pond there, she should be quite a bit smaller. Look at her compared to the boat that's right next to her, to the right. So that's a little weird. In fact, all the objects, in a way, seem to kind of hover in space. And so it lacks depth, and it involves these brutal contrasts of light and dark. It looks staged. And really kind of turns the illusionist Renaissance window on its head. And Manet replaced this Renaissance sense of space with a new unifying logic. lush, oily, thickly applied paint that covers the entire surface. This begins the modern tradition. It emphasizes the abstract qualities of art, the non-illusionistic aspects. And it really is the emphasis on painting as a construct rather than a window. And that makes it entirely revolutionary. This particular painting, Olympia, was actually accepted to the Salon 2 years later. But really, it was even more scandalous than Luncheon on the Grass. Here he depicts a prostitute with a distinctly upper-class clientele. In fact, Olympia was a common name for high-class prostitutes. And so just the title of the painting itself reveals what we're looking at. And this painting is more real than idealized, like a lot of the work that's kind of comes under the guise of realism. Some critics claimed she looked like a gorilla. So this wasn't an idealized female form so much. It was all business. And she's like returning this direct gaze of the viewer, as if the viewer were one of her clients. Much like with Luncheon in the Grass, we see an influence of art history. Again, a very modern kind of thing to make work about other work, almost like, appropriation, something we're going to talk about much later on down the road. But this is something that artists have always done, but particularly we see a direct influence with some of Manet's paintings. And here, we can see the influence by Titian's Venus of Urbino. Titian's Venus seems passive, passively gazing at the viewer, kind of languid, which is very different than Manet's version. Here it is again. We see in her face this sort of indifferent look, and not particularly seductive, and it's read as almost like shameless. This subverted the expectations of the viewer and really evokes a sense of discomfort. One critic said, here we see a courtesan with dirty hands and wrinkled feet. Her body has a livid hint of a cadaver displayed in the morgue. Her outlines are drawn in charcoal, and her greenish, bloodshot eyes appear to be provoking the public. There are abrupt shifts in tonality in this work, and again, we see a looser kind of brushstroke, and it kind of focuses on harsh truths. Emile Zola said, "When other artists correct nature by painting Venus, they lie. Manet asks himself why he should lie. Why not tell the truth?" So like we said, Manet is sort of in the realist tradition, but then not sort of too. The works, really lack a certain kind of like spatial depth that was more common in the tradition of realism, which is a stylistic choice for sure, but also mimics what was happening with a brand new technology at the time, photography. Daguerreotypes, which are sort of like the first photographs, were all the rage in Paris at this time, and you had photo studios everywhere. These photographs were certainly not considered art by the establishment. It seemed to a lot of people like it might just be a fad used to make cheesy portrait cards and pornography. The figure in Olympia is blasted by photography studio lighting, and you can see here the kind of the almost outlined cast shadows of a bright light coming from right where the viewer is very much like a flash in a photograph. Today that doesn't look that strange, but in 1865 people used chiaroscuro in painting, and Olympia looked like an arrangement of flat patterns, lacking a sense of depth and three-dimensionality that a viewer would expect to see in a painting. Manet was an incredibly revolutionary figure when it comes to painting. So, a little bit ago we talked about a small group of young artists who were taken by Manet's painting at the Salon des Refuses. This bunch of alienated kids found common ground with one another. They started hanging out together in bars and coffee shops, and they went on to mount their own shows, completely independent of the Academy. In our own time, they are some of the most admired artists in the whole world, and there are museum lines around whole city blocks to see their work. I'm talking about the Impressionists. Who were the Impressionists? There were 10 or so core members, a few of them whose names you will certainly recognize. Monet, different than Manet, who we've been talking about. Monet, Degas, Renoir, Cassatt. These were artists that were schooled in Paris. They were concerned with light and color of the landscape under various conditions. And they cited Edouard Manet as their leader, although he never really agreed to exhibit with them, and he kind of saw them as a bunch of little ruffians. Impressionist works seem subjective, loose, and free to us now, but really they were much more scientific in their intent. The Impressionists carefully studied light and color. They painted the light and the color instead of the objects. Or what I mean is they painted what we see versus what was there. In a lot of ways, almost like the polar opposite of the Northern European Renaissance artists like Van Eyck or Dürer. The Impressionists saw the world for what it really was. When you're seeing things around you, you're not really seeing the things themselves. You're seeing the light that bounces off those things and then reflects off it and hits you in the eye. And that's what they were really interested in. What subjects did the Impressionists paint? Modern life. Everyday scenes. Some were landscapes, some were interiors. But every single one had a really particular concern with light. Usually the Impressionists were apolitical, unlike the Realists. But there were some exceptions to that. In order for the Impressionists to really see the light, they had to go to where the light was. And so there was a real shift to what's called plein air painting, which is painting outside, on the spot, as opposed to within the confines of the painting studio. And this was certainly aided by the availability of oil paints in tubes. Artists, like for the first time, artists could buy their paint pre-made inside these aluminum tubes. And that really opened up a lot of possibilities that didn't exist before. With the Impressionists, there's always this feeling of the moment and a desire to appear modern. The Impressionists tried to outdo photography because they no longer had to record faithfully what was in front of them, but could capture the world's fleeting moments. That's something that photography at the time, that was impossible for photography to do at the time, because the shutter had to be open for so long that it could never capture like the moment like a painter could. In 1874, they organized their first exhibition. It was called the Anonymous Society of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, Printmakers. They got the label Impressionists as a derogatory remark about the show from a critic who said that the work in the show was too sketchy. It was like impressions rather than finished paintings. And in fact, this is the painting that Impressionism was named for. Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise. And remember, this is Monet, not Manet. It's like Parthenon and Pantheon. We see here Monet's interest in the intensity of complementary colors. In this case, the blues and the oranges and the reds and the greens. The brushstrokes are evident, even more so, kind of building on what Manet had done, but getting even more bold and brash with the loose and spontaneous brushwork. It was not especially illusionistic, it's pretty obvious that this isn't like a a body of water with boats on it. You can see the brush marks. It's not all that convincing in terms of depicting something in the world, but rather it's about the light itself. It's about the light, not the boats, not the waves. It's about the light. And it's also about the recording of these visual sensations. Here you can perhaps see the influence of Turner. Very different aims, but a similar kind of look. In 1894, Monet set out to study changing light conditions on the Rouen Cathedral. He studied the effects of light on forms in the world. And so he painted 40 canvases of the Rouen Cathedral from the same angle, same composition, same kind of cropping, but each of them at different times of the day. And this really records the passage of time. This is one of my favorite kind of projects of his, and I find it really fascinating, so I'm excited for you to see some of them. Here are 4 of the canvases from that series, and you can see the local color of the objects and how that doesn't stay constant, and how the actual real color of the objects change radically depending on the amount and quality of light, or depending on the time of day that you're seeing it in. He saw how drastic that color change was, from like the early morning to the mid-afternoon to just before dark. What he would do is he would have all these canvases kind of with him. He would go out into the space, and he'd have one that he would paint on for like 20 minutes. And then after that 20 minutes is up, at that particular time of day, he'd put it away until tomorrow, get out the next painting, like the 9:30 painting. Then put that away and get out the 10 o'clock painting. And so he would work on these paintings day after day until they were all finished. And each one where he was examining the color of the cathedral, based on the light that was hitting at the time. And this, we could see that in the shadows there was color. It wasn't just a flat black, but we see the difference between the reflected light, the direct light of the sun versus the reflected light, particularly of the sky, and how these hues change from light to shadow. And it was a real sparkling, kind of brilliant effect. The Impressionists actually begin to sort of catch on and become somewhat popular in Paris as the public starts to, quote, get it. And then as this was happening, more alternatives to the salon emerged, and the art market boomed. Private shows and salons were organized outside of the context of the Academy. And art dealers then became interested in the burgeoning scene of, quote, modern art. Another important Impressionist artist was Edgar Degas, who was, perhaps more than any other artist that I'm aware of, was the master of radical compositional choices. He was clearly the most daring of all the Impressionists. His cropping shows interest in photography. And in fact, he used photography for preparatory studies for his paintings. And in his works, the imagery almost always extends outside the bounds of the picture. Degas was fascinated with dancers and performers. He did several paintings of dancers kind of getting ready, rather than in the act of performing. And so it was kind of this informal view of this very formal discipline. And they also seemed to be done outside the model's awareness. Although she didn't know he was there, and they were not actually posing per se. Degas said, quote, "I want to look through the keyhole." The spatial organization in Degas' work was influenced a whole bunch by Japanese prints. A little earlier, in 1853, an American Commodore steamed into Tokyo Bay and forced Japan to open its doors to the West. They had been sort of isolating themselves for many, 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 many years up to this point. But when this happened, the French became fascinated with Japanese culture. And there was a specific term that emerged at the time, Japonisme, to describe the Japanese aesthetic. This Japanese aesthetic became very popular with fashionable Parisians who started wearing kimonos. They would have tea sets and screens. And the Japanese woodblock prints were widely distributed around Europe. And they featured broad areas of color that really embraced flatness rather than trying to deny it. We see like a sort of unmodulated sense of color, and often this kind of lack of natural gradations. And even more so, we see really strong angles, very forceful angles that create like really dynamic compositions in the work. The forms are outlined, enhancing the flatness, and there's this abrupt kind of cropping that happens. And so it's really easy to see the way that Degas was so influenced by these artworks. And Degas did pastel drawings as well as paintings. Here's just yet another example of his innovative, daring, complex compositional arrangements. With this woman in the bath, the contrast on the left of her hair being kind of balanced out by this hard, slightly diagonal, vertical line on the right-hand side, with her body butting almost right up against it, and even that hairbrush going over the edge. All sorts of little intricate placements of objects that makes Degas really, to my mind, the master of composition. Here is Pierre-Auguste Renoir, a painter using bright color, bold paint handling, and modern subjects, who is still involved in the figurative tradition. This is Le Moulin de la Galette, a bright Sunday afternoon crowd in a popular Parisian dance venue. People are talking, flirting, dancing, crowding the tables. There's a casualness about this painting. It's not formally composed at all. And his work often kind of deals with the incidental or the momentary or the passing, hallmark of the Impressionist aesthetic. We see patches of sunlight and shadow through the leaves. And colors of the same forms kind of shift from the sunlit area to the shaded area. It almost makes the scene like kind of hard to see, in a way kind of like reality itself. Here we have a rare entry of an American in this whole semester discussion. I guess if you don't count Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, this maybe is the first American artist. But this American artist, Mary Cassatt, lived in Paris and was part of this group, which is notable. The fact that there was a woman in part of a very much male-dominated kind of society. But Mary Cassatt was an American who lived in Paris and was admired by Degas. So she was one of very few women in the group of the we know as Impressionists, and maybe even what makes her more of a minority is that she was American. She was the only American. She was influenced by Degas' compositions, and likewise with these Japanese prints that were so popular at the time. But her subjects were more intimate and domestic. For one thing, as a woman, she wasn't able to go out to the cafes that the male artists went to, and so she didn't have quite the same opportunities for subject matter. Her work involved a sense of flatness and really emphasizes pattern. Her subjects were unposed, sort of in these in-between moments, and her works are not overtly sentimental. A little bit, but not. It's kind of a cute kind of scene, but they're not so overtly sentimental. They're a little bit more objective than, like, say, a romantic artist. By this time, there was a conscious desire to move forward. I mentioned this term before, the avant-garde. It was originally a military term that refers to those who were the first to go into the battle, like the immediate front line. The actual translation is like cutting edge, like the cutting edge of a knife blade is the avant-garde. In the 1880s, artists adopted this term and referred to themselves as avant-garde artists if they worked in an innovative way, like going into new territory. And the one group of artists that did this is what we will talk about next in our next lecture. And these will be the post-impressionists. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.